Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for attending or tuning into our 43rd episode of the Peaceable Kingdom Hour, which is titled Anglicanism/Episcopalianism. My name is Matthew A. King, and I am your host. This live stream is made possible in collaboration with allcreatures.org, leading the way in faith based vegan animal rights since 1998, and with the Christian Animal Rights Association, a non denominational Bible based ministry. All opinions and teachings expressed in this series are the commentaries of me, Matthew A. King. And before I get started, too, I want to say you probably noticed my voice is a little strained. My wife and I were in Cleveland over the weekend protesting for Marriott has cages in their supply chain of eggs, so we were protesting against that, along with a lot of other activists. And then there was also a restaurant in Cleveland called Downtown 140 that we protested that still sells foie gras, and so we joined those actions and did protest for about 4 hours on Friday and Saturday each. And so my voice is a little strained from it. So excuse my voice, but it was lost for a good reason. And so I know most of you will probably agree. And it's funny too, because I always try to prevent that by like really moistening my throat like throughout it. But I think just the 8 hours total in 2 days, I think really strained my voice, regardless of how much I try to prevent it. But I know you guys will understand. But before I jump in, there's a little bit of a disclaimer. This is about Anglicanism and Episcopalianism, and so it's naturally sort of anti-Catholic or has a little bit of anti-Catholic sentiment. That's not, of course, the intention. It's just the historical reality. It's not intended to be offensive. If there's anything that you find offensive, please feel free to step out at any time, or just come back to it another time, or feel whatever you feel. It's totally understandable. But so while stepping in here, the teaching agenda after the disclaimer here is we're going to look at the definition of Anglicanism. Then we're going to talk about Anglican history, beliefs, distinct practices, worship, and church structure. And then we'll have some quotes from C.S. Lewis about animals, because I usually try to include a famous person that spoke highly of animals from each denomination. And of course, C.S. Lewis is the famous Anglican. And so, of course, I had to include him. And then we'll examine a couple different Anglican animal welfare organizations. And Anglicans tend to be pretty progressive. And so we'll talk about the Anglican Society for the Welfare of Animals and Christ the Savior Anglican Church Ministry to Pet Families. And so I'll go over those as well. But jumping in, you might be wondering, why is this teaching called Anglicanism/Episcopalianism? And the reason is because they're one and the same. But basically, Anglicanism is closely associated with Episcopalianism. And like this source, it says, while often used interchangeably, Anglican and Episcopalian are not entirely synonymous. Episcopalian refers specifically to the American branch of the Anglican Communion, while Anglican is a broader term encompassing the worldwide community of churches descended from the Church of England. And so Anglicanism means the Church of England, basically, or where it originated from, whereas Episcopalianism is the American branch of Anglicanism. And so that's what the association is. And so, like they said here, therefore, all Episcopalians are Anglicans, but not all Anglicans are Episcopalians. And so basically, if you're an Episcopalian, you're an American branch of the Anglican Church. But if you're an Anglican in the Church of England, you're not an Episcopalian. You would have to be in the United States to be recognized as that. And I don't know why that is, too. I don't know why the different definitions. Some of it might be the fact that the U.S. split off from England, and so maybe they wanted a different term that didn't remind them of England. That would be my first guess, but I really don't know. Probably some anti-British sentiment from the 1700s and 1800s, I would imagine. But again, I don't know. But what exactly is Anglicanism now that we have Episcopalianism out of the way? But Anglicanism, it's one of the major branches of the 16th century Protestant Reformation, and a form of Christianity that includes features of both Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. And so Anglicanism is loosely organized in the Anglican Communion, a worldwide family of religious bodies that represents the offspring of the Church of England and recognizes the Archbishop of Canterbury as its nominal head. It prizes traditional worship and structure, but operates autonomously and flexibly in different locales. And so although the Anglican Communion has a creed, which is known as the 39 Articles, it has been disposed to allow widely divergent interpretations. And that's something that you'll find with Anglicanism, is a lot of different interpretations. Thus, Anglicans see themselves as possessing a cluster of historic pieties and procedural loyalties, but few firm rules. And that's something that you'll see too, is that they're not very firm on, you have to believe this, you have to believe that. They're a little bit more loose about their belief systems. But the Book of Common Prayer, it's a compilation of the church's liturgical forms. It was originally issued in 1549, which was slightly before the Protestant Reformation, but it represents the faith's independence from Rome and remains the hallmark of Anglican identity. And the prayer book derives from ancient English spirituality and embodies the uniqueness of Anglican Christianity. And so the Book of Common Prayer basically was an independence from the Roman Catholic Church. And so they broke off from Roman Catholicism around that time. And so that Book of Common Prayer is pretty much their central identity about who the Anglicans are and what they believe. And it was pretty central because they broke off from Roman Catholicism. And so diving into history, of course, too, Christianity in England. And so the Church of England, the mother church of the Anglican Communion, has a long history. And so that's really the head of the Anglican worldwide communion, is the Church of England. Christianity probably began to be practiced in England not later than the early 3rd century. And by the 4th century, the church was established well enough to send 3 British bishops of Londinium, which is London, Eboracum, which is York, and Lindum, which is Lincoln, to the Council of Arles in present-day France in 314. And so it looks like England started experiencing Christianity around the 3rd or 4th century. So it makes sense because it probably took a while for missionaries to finally get up there because it's pretty north of Rome. But in the 5th century, after the Romans had withdrawn from Britain and the Anglo-Saxons had invaded it, St. Illtyd and St. Patrick performed missionary work in Wales and in Ireland, respectively. And so St. Patrick, he is known as, basically the patron saint of Ireland. And he has his own holiday recognized, maybe unofficially, all across the world. And so he was actually a big missionary in Ireland. And so that's why he's named St. Patrick. And so isolated from continental Christianity in 5th and 6th centuries, Christianity in the British Isles, especially in the north, was influenced by Irish Christianity, which was organized around monasteries rather than episcopal sees. And then about 563, St. Columba, founded on influential monastic community on the island of Iona in the inner Hebrides Islands of Scotland. An important step in the history of the English Church was taken in 596 when St. Augustine was sent on a mission to England by Pope Gregory the Great. And so that was a big deal, was St. Augustine, probably the most famous church figure after Christ and the disciples. St. Augustine was a huge part of, he basically recognized the doctrine of original sin, but he was instrumental to this because he was sent on a mission to England by the Pope at the time, Pope Gregory the Great. And then that was a big deal because he was charged with evangelizing the largely pagan southern English kingdoms and establishing Roman ecclesiastical organization. And so he basically spread Roman Catholicism big time to England. And he successfully preached to the King of Kent, converting him and a large number of his followers in 597. And Augustine's Archbishopric of Canterbury soon became the symbolic seat of England's church, which established important ties to Rome under his leadership. And so the Archbishop of Canterbury, he became sort of the official recognition of England as it was under Rome. And so it had a deep tie to Roman Catholicism. Subsequent mission work, such as that of St. Aidan in northern England around 634, helped to solidify the English church. And then at the Synod of Whitby in 664, the Church of Northumbria, and it's one of the northern English kingdoms, it broke its ties with the Celtic church and accepted Roman usage, bringing the English church more fully into line with Roman and continental practices. So there was a little bit of a tension there between England because they were influenced by Celtic Christianity, but also by Roman Christianity. And so there was a little bit of a tension there. And the early church in England was a distinctive fusion of British, Celtic, and Roman influences. And so although adopting the episcopal structure favored by the Church of Rome, it retained powerful centers in the monasteries. And the most important British sees were the archbishops of York and Canterbury, which often competed for primacy. And so then there started to become different archbishops in different cities, and a lot of them wanted authority over other cities to be recognized by Rome, and who to listen to. But representatives of the church, such as the great historian and scholar Bede, Bede, he played an important role in the development of English culture. And that's a historical figure that's pretty well known in England. Bede is his name. A lot of people think his name is Bidet, actually, because it's sort of spelled the same way, but it's pronounced Bede. But the church sometimes found itself at odds with the English monarchy, as when St. Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury, went into exile during controversies over the investiture of William Rufus and Henry I. And St. Anselm actually was a pretty big figure. He actually created, it was an atonement theory. I can't remember what it was exactly. Let me look. It was basically looking at Christ's death and resurrection. What did that mean as far as atonement? But yeah, it says Anselm of Canterbury's satisfaction theory of atonement posits that human sin is a dishonoring of God that creates an unpayable debt, requiring satisfaction to restore God's honor and maintain his justice. So it's known as the satisfaction theory of atonement. But when I was studying this, I was like, oh, St. Anselm, he's pretty well known. I wonder, he did something and I couldn't remember what it was. And I remember reading that he was part of that atonement theory. So he was a pretty controversial figure within the Church of England. But the martyrdom of St. Thomas Becket, the most famous case of church-state conflict, demonstrated the church's concern to protect its integrity against the throne in the 12th century. So there was some tension there also between the church and the royalty of the country where, it was running the country. Question of sort of who has more power, church or state. But the writings of John Wycliffe, they questioned the form of the medieval church and became an early protest against control of the English church by Rome. And so you can already see, even in the 12th century, there was a lot of debates about, whether to break away from Rome, even as early as the 12th century. Under King Henry VIII in the 16th century, the Church of England broke with Rome, largely because Pope Clement VII refused to grant Henry an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. And so that's a pretty famous situation. That situation was detailed in the movie The Other Boleyn Girl. That was with Eric Bana and Natalie Portman. I found it to be pretty boring, but if you're a history scholar or you really enjoy English history, definitely catch that one because it details that issue of King Henry's annulment of his marriage from Catherine of Aragon, and that was a really big deal within the church, and that actually caused the schism between Rome and the Anglican Church. Wishing no reform except along the lines of Erasmus's Christian humanism, Henry intended to replace Rome's authority over the English Church with his own. And so that's where he split from Rome and then basically created his own authority, which was basically the English recognition of the Protestant Reformation, as they were part of that around the same time that Luther was also having things going on in Germany, as well as John Calvin. So there was just a lot of things going on in that 15th, 16th century that was going on with breaking away from Rome and Roman Catholicism. Upon Henry's death, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer began changes that allied the Church of England with the Reformation. And so his Book of Common Prayer revised traditional forms of worship to incorporate Protestant ideas. These efforts, however, were overturned by Queen Mary, who sought to restore Roman Catholicism in England. And so there again becomes some tension where Roman Catholicism started having a surge and it started competing again with Anglicanism after Henry. When Elizabeth I assumed the throne in 1558, the Reformation in England triumphed. And the theologian John Jewell wrote that the Church of England had returned to ancient precedent. Richard Hooker defended the church against attacks by English Puritans and Catholics. And although the Puritans achieved political power in the Commonwealth in the mid-17th century, the subsequent restoration of 1660 marked the beginning of more than a century of great influence for the Church of England. The church dominated England's religious life, becoming a considerable social and spiritual force and closely allying itself with the power of the throne. And so the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, became basically entwined with the politics of the throne or the royal family. So that was a big part of this. And then it generated impressive forms of philanthropy, and clergy commonly performed the duties of civil servants. And so that's sort of where the English art flourished as well, because of the allyship of the church with politics. And so the church's hold on English religious life began to wane in the 18th century, despite impressive reform efforts. John Wesley, Charles Simeon, John Newton, and other clergy associated with the evangelical revival prompted a surge of new religious fervor. And so evangelical laity, such as William Wilberforce, in the Clapham sect, fought slavery and encouraged social reform. And so in the 18th century, there was a lot of people that were applying Christianity and its principles to social reform. And so William Wilberforce was very important in the abolition of slavery in England, and very much a part of that Anglican understanding of reforming the government. I want to look up too, was William Wilberforce an Anglican? I think he was, but I could be wrong. Let me look. Yeah, William Wilberforce was an evangelical Anglican who underwent a spiritual conversion in 1785. Yeah, he was a notable Anglican, and he was a big part of why slavery in Britain was abolished. And he did it, based on Christian ideas and principles. And then Luke Daniels, I had a comment come through. He said, "Hello, Matthew, tuning in. Thanks so much, Luke. So glad to have you. Always appreciate it." And you might have heard I strained my voice protesting this weekend, so that's why I'm a little bit difficult to hear. But like I said, we were protesting Marriott for using cages with their procurement of eggs, and then we were also protesting a restaurant for selling foie gras in Cleveland. And so like 8 hours of protesting Friday, Saturday in total. So my voice is a little strained, but I know you'll understand. But jumping back into, in the early 19th century, the Anglo-Catholic High Church Oxford movement, led by John Henry Newman, that's a pretty famous name, John Keble and E.B. Pusey, attempted to recover the ancient liturgy and respond to social concerns. The church made impressive efforts to encompass the diversity of modern English life while retaining its traditional identity. And so that's something that's really interesting about Anglicanism too, is that it's sort of embraces the old, but also embraces the new. And so there's an interesting tension that goes on with a lot of Anglican churches. They're always willing to sort of be open to ideas. It's definitely a church that would flourish in America, because the United States sort of founds itself on that freedom of speech and social reform by the free exchange of ideas, and that's something Anglicanism is very notable for. But also, Anglicanism has a long history of social justice, social reform, and like William Wilberforce, he abolished slavery, was very sympathetic to the welfare of animals, as well as I believe the man that created the RSPCA, he might have been Anglican as well. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but I could be wrong. But there was a lot of social justice focus within the Anglican Church. But developments in worldwide Anglicanism: from the time of the Reformation, the Church of England expanded, following the routes of British exploration and colonization. And so it served indigenous peoples and expatriates alike, and all initially considered themselves loyal to the See of Canterbury. So Anglicanism sort of was tied into, as we all know, British colonialism. And British colonialism stretched from India, United States, Canada. I don't think there was much in South America. I think that was mostly Spain and Portugal, but a big part of Africa as well. And so a lot of Anglicanism was spread to Africa through British colonization. Now, I realize that's a controversial topic. I'm not saying that colonialism was overall good, but it did spread Anglicanism regardless of any historical debate. But the church's great missionary societies were important agents of its growth beyond England. The Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, which was founded in 1699, and also the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, that was founded in 1701. And then there's also the Church Missionary Society, which began in 1799. They achieved a global identity. These societies undertook mission work among indigenous peoples in the British colonies and began the process of transferring authority in church matters to local leadership. And so that became an issue as well, is with church leadership, did everybody have to report to the leaders in England at all times, or as frequently as they needed to? And it became more a matter of sort of what we see with governments now, is that cities have the right to make their own laws generally, and not with the state's input. The state should mostly leave its affairs to cities, because different issues come up in different cities. And then that's where the issue of preemption comes in, and the debate between how much should a state have authority over a city, in what it does. But that's sort of the same thing that's happened throughout history, especially in the Anglican Church. But Anglicanism thus came to function as a decentralized body of national churches, loyal to one another and to the forms of faith inherited from the Church of England. Social and political circumstances often hastened the development of autonomy. The American Revolution compelled the organization of the Episcopal Church in the United States of America, which is known as the ECUSA, which completed its structure by 1789, so like right after the Civil War, or I'm sorry, the American Revolution. And then the first American bishop, Samuel Seabury, was consecrated in Scotland in 1784. And the Anglican Church of Canada established its own separate organization in 1893, though it was known as the Church of England in Canada until 1959, as did the Anglican Church of Australia in 1962. And so vigorous missionary work in the British colonies produced strong churches in such diverse places as Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, India, and Australia. And so along with these British colonies that were in Africa and Australia, and then British, American, and Canadian Anglicans combined their efforts in China and Japan. And so the church left an impressive legacy of educational institutions and medical facilities. Here and there, members of indigenous peoples became clergy and even bishops. And then Samuel Crowther of Nigeria became the first African bishop in 1864. And so, as you can see, Anglicanism has spread all over the world because of the missionary work in the British colonies. But consolidation and indigenous characterized the Anglican mission in its later years. Beginning in the late 19th century, Anglican bishops attended the Lambeth Conference, held once every 10 years at the residence of the Archbishop of Canterbury in London. And so the immediate cause of the first meeting in 1867 was a controversy that arose in one of the colonial churches. And this is actually really interesting. I read about this because I didn't know about this. So the Archbishop of Cape Town, Robert Gray, he was a high church or traditionalist, what we would call sort of Orthodox today. He wanted the Bishop of Natal, known as John Colenso, who was low church or evangelical, which means basically not as Orthodox. But Robert Gray wanted John Colenso to be arraigned on charges of heresy for holding what was then regarded as advanced views of the creation stories in the opening chapters of Genesis. The controversy around intense feelings and anxieties on a wide range of issues, doctrinal, personal, and organizational, among all the Anglican churches throughout the world. And Bishop Colenso was convicted and deposed in the church courts, but upon appeal to the civil courts of England, he won his case and retained his church properties. And so it's actually known as, I had to read up on this. It was actually interesting. The Colenso controversy. And I thought this was interesting because this is still going on today, but it was basically that Colenso wanted to teach the harmony between evolution and Genesis 1 and 2, and then other more Orthodox preachers said that was heretical. And I would agree as well that it would be heretical, because if you, I talked about this, and is the Bible in alignment with evolution? And I've declared that they're not. I don't see how it's a good thing for them to be combined. But regardless of that, there's actually a really interesting on creation.com. It's called the Colenso controversy, and it was really cool because I flipping through it here. It said, let me see. Colenso rejected the historical accuracy of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, alleging inconsistencies and contradictions. The Pentateuch includes creation, the fall, the flood, and Exodus. And then, consistent with Jesus's words, the mainstream church at the time generally believed Moses wrote the entire Pentateuch. In line with the higher criticism flourishing in Germany for decades prior, Colenso challenged this. He proposed alternative theories for his authorship. And then Colenso opposed both slavery and racism, but he embraced polygenism, thinking that the creation of several atoms was needed to account for human races. And so he started incorporating a little bit of this Darwinism aspects and findings that they had of the age of the earth. And that created controversy within the church, especially among more of the Orthodox members. Yeah, and it says the so-called Colenso controversy unfolded during the mid to late 19th century when Bishop Colenso ignited a theological dispute. He openly questioned traditional interpretations of the Bible, particularly the Old Testament. His critical reappraisal of biblical texts and his unorthodox perspectives led to divisions within the Anglican Church. It also unleashed many debates and sparked intense conflict concerning the authority and interpretation of Scripture. And it says Colenso wrote several decades after the publication of Charles Lyell's Principle of Geology. Lyell, a deist, taught that the Earth's features had been shaped only by the sort of forces operating today, and essentially the same rates, or uniformitarianism. This needed vast ages, thus undermining the biblical timeline. Lyell's system of thought explicitly excluded all significant catastrophism, particularly the mega catastrophe described in the Bible, or basically the flood. A copy of Lyell's Principles accompanied Darwin on his HMS Beagle voyage. This was to the Galapagos, and he was instrumental in the development of Darwin's own beliefs. Lyell's idea also helped greatly help the rapid acceptance of evolution. Far from being an impartial truth seeker, in private correspondence, Lyell outlined his passion to free geology from Moses. And then Colenso cited Lyell on occasion, knew him personally, and corresponded with him extensively. So it is not surprising that Colenso rejected the flood narrative, and he writes that while translating the story of the flood, a native tribes, I won't get into that, but had the bishop been predisposed to believe the Bible's account is accurate, he could have diligently sought answers. And so basically it was just this big controversy between Colenso about his beliefs in basically the science of the day, which was that Darwin and Lyell had basically undermined the integrity of the Bible, and he was mostly agreeing with that. Let me see here too. There was also that was the Colenso controversy. But anyways, jumping back into this other part, I thought that was really interesting reading about that, so I wanted to share it. But the most important organizational issue raised by the dispute concerning the relationship between the church's various branches, because they lack an authoritative center, however, Anglicans have continued to rely upon consultation and consensus to coordinate matters of belief and practice. And so it's sort of like Congregationalism, but not as much separate, is that there is a head in Anglicanism, but it's not as strict and followed as strictly. And so churches have a wide allowance to sort of preach a lot of different things. The end of colonialism and the rise of newly independent countries compelled Anglicans to rethink their identity and mission. Once the church of the colonizer, Anglicanism spawned a host of self-directed churches linked by common form and historical allegiance to the Church of England. In most cases, Anglicanism was able to adopt in an affirmative way to new and changing social circumstances. In 1947, for example, Anglicans joined several Christian bodies to create the Church of South India, a unique ecumenical union. Even more dramatic developments took place in Africa, where the early 21st century, more than half of all Anglicans worldwide lived. And so Africa is a huge seedbed for a lot of Anglicanism. In 2004, the church in Africa sought to establish its own identity at the first African Anglicans Bishop Conference. The bishops and council declared that the church in Africa had come of age and should focus on issues of poverty and social justice. The council called for the creation of institutions to train clerics in Africa rather than in England or America, and to develop a theology relevant to African society. And so they were sort of also requesting this not to be so much influenced by a lot of Anglicanism or how England is right now, but Africa wanted its own ability to determine its theology and where the church was heading, and have this sort of independence from the Anglican Church, but still be associated loosely. Anglicans, as I noted before, they have frequently been articulate opponents of injustice. Archbishop Jawani Lawum of Uganda, for example, was martyred for his opposition to the rule of Idi Amin. And Idi Amin was a notorious ruler in Africa, specifically Uganda. They actually made a movie about his life called The Last King of Scotland. That's a really good movie if you get a chance to catch it. But it was all about Idi Amin, who was played by Forrest Whitaker, who won the Oscar for that role. But a really good movie if you catch it. And it explores a lot of the sort of psychology and the ideas behind Idi Amin. In South Africa, the Anglican Church consistently opposed apartheid. And Archbishop Desmond Tutu won the Nobel Prize for Peace in 1984 for his stand on behalf of racial equity. And so Desmond Tutu is a pretty famous voice. He was the Archbishop of the Church of the Anglican Church in South Africa, and so he's been a widely influential figure. He's spoken up for racial injustice, LGBTQ injustice. It might have been that he spoke up against feminine injustice or discrimination or injustice against women. And so Desmond Tutu is a very influential voice against injustice. And then as well, apartheid, the Anglican Church opposed that, which was a big part of Nelson Mandela. I'm not sure what religion he identified as. I don't think it was Anglican, but obviously they had an involvement against apartheid. Anglicans, though, rarely became revolutionaries, however, because the church views its task as working for justice through existing institutions. And so with an Anglicanism, you have these people that sort of reform society, but not really these people that revolutionize society. And so it's kind of interesting because you have people like Desmond Tutu, like William Wilberforce, who spoke out against these racial and slavery injustices, but they didn't totally overhaul society either, and that's not a bad thing. It's just facts. From the mid-19th century, and the Church of England developed a similar posture toward establishing social justice. Still, England's official church, it experienced attrition during the 19th and 20th centuries, and during the same period, a succession of leaders sought to enhance the church's claim to be the soul of the nation. And then in the mid-19th century, Christian socialism, a movement that attempted to apply the social principles of Christianity to modern industrial life, found proponents in the Church of England. Sparked by the theologian F.D. Maurice, the movement within the Anglican Church was subsequently led by clergy such as Stuart Headlam and Henry Scott Holland. And then in the 20th century, William Temple, the Archbishop of Canterbury from 1942 to 1944, emphasized that the church should be a community of worship in step with modern life. And so that's what leads me to, probably everybody's very familiar with him, the scholar and lay theologian C.S. Lewis responded to modern doubts in a sensitive restatement of the tenets of Christian belief. And so he created several books, Mere Christianity. Everybody probably knows him as the authors of the Chronicles of Narnia. And I found C.S. Lewis to be a lot of Christian authors. I don't really understand why, the love affair with some of these authors, I'm not like deeply impressed by, but it's hard not to be impressed by C.S. Lewis. He's very articulate, and he says things in a very sensitive and a very understanding manner. And probably the closest person I could compare him to would be probably Mr. Rogers, because he had that sort of same sweet, sensitive mindset. And if you look up C.S. Lewis, very rarely did he ever say anything offensive. It's like that. There's a picture of Mr. Rogers flicking somebody off, and it's funny because that was probably a very abnormal behavior for Mr. Rogers. And it's kind of the same thing with C.S. Lewis. Is like, he was always a very dignified man that would never say anything hateful or try to bring anybody down. He was always very, very edifying, and he was the type of person that a person that represents a sea that rises all ships. He makes everybody around him better rather than cutting people down. But John A.T. Robinson, Bishop of Woolwich, affirmed the searching quality of modern Christian experience. And so then with his teachings, I wanted to get into a little bit of like doctrinal views of the Anglican Church. So what has come to be known as the Lambeth Quadrilateral defines the essential beliefs of Anglicanism. First suggested by an American, William Reed Huntington, in 1870, the Quadrilateral states 4 elements essential to the Anglican conception of Christian identity. The Bible being 1, the Nicene Creed is 2, baptism is 3rd, as well as Holy Communion. That's 1 item. So basically the sacraments, baptism and Holy Communion. And then 4 is the episcopate. And so that's the 4 elements of an essential Anglican experience. But the Anglican communion thus holds to the faith as expounded by the scriptures and by the early church fathers. It respects the authority of the state, but does not submit to it. And it equally respects the freedom of the individual. And so Anglicans, they respect the authority of the state, but they do not submit to it. And so they decide, whether they want to submit to, if a state is doing something, whether justice or injustice. The Anglican Communion does not seek to evade the challenges of the world or to live a life separate from it. Based on its doctrines on the Bible, the Anglican Communion allows a remarkable latitude of interpretation by both clergy and laity. The Church of England holds close to the spirit of the 39 Articles, a doctrinal statement drawn up by the clergy of Canterbury in the mid-16th century and approved by Elizabeth I in 1571. Nevertheless, subscription to the Articles is not required of the laity, and adherence by the clergy is expected only in a general way. Other churches or councils of the Anglican Communion take different views of the Articles, but none regard them as having, for example, the status of the historical statements of belief set forth in the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed. And so that's really important, is that 39 Articles, that's basically a doctrinal statement about Anglicanism / Episcopalianism, but it's not, it's definitely a part of Anglicanism, is very important, but it's not revered like, say, the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed. They are also not given the status of other 16th century doctrinal statements, such as the Augsburg Confession of the Lutheran churches or the Westminster Confession of the Reformed and Presbyterian churches. So they're not held to that level that those other churches hold these other documents. And also within ministry, Anglicans accept a threefold order of ministry, which consists of bishops, priests or presbyters, and deacons. And so although they hold a view to the view of succession from the apostles, they are not committed to any particular theory regarding the conveyance of that ministry. Anglicans attempt to balance the clerical point of view with forms of authority that include the laity. And that's something that you'll see too, is they sort of keep up with trends. But even bishops are rarely able to function without the advice and consent of other clergy and laity. And then worship and organization. Anglican worship. Worship is the center of Anglican life. Anglicans view their tradition as a broad form of public prayer, and they attempt to encompass diverse Christian styles in a traditional context. And although the Book of Common Prayer is the most apparent mark of Anglican identity, it has undergone many revisions and wears national guises. The Prayer Book of 1662 represents the official version in the Church of England. Book of Common Prayer, again, very important. But a 1928 version is commonly used. In 2000, the Church introduced Common Worship, a modernized collection of services and prayers, as an official alternative to the 1662 Prayer Book. And that's probably because the 1662 Prayer Book probably became unreadable, because a lot of it is probably Old English, and people just don't talk like that anymore. But in recent years, there has been a recovery of ancient liturgical styles and vestments, as well as an increased emphasis on the Eucharist as the central act of Christian worship. Experimental rites have appeared in different parts of the Anglican world. Change in Anglican worship has meant increased variety, new rules for the laity, and a tendency toward freedom of expression while retaining the essence of the church's traditional forms. And that's a big part of it as well, is because, the Anglican Church was brought over to America, and probably a lot of those people were part of the founding of the United States very early. Freedom of expression is a very central part of the Anglican Church, and that's something that aligns well with the United States. Comprehensiveness in doctrine and practice, often said to be the middle way between Roman Catholic and Protestant churches, the Anglican Communion is comprehensive in matters of doctrine and practice, while asserting the importance of the apostolic succession of bishops in the Book of Common Prayer. It nevertheless allows a considerable degree of flexibility in most doctrinal and liturgical matters. And so that's something that you'll see with Anglican churches too, is they're pretty progressive, pretty open-minded. Thus, within the communion, there are several schools of thought and practice, including the High Church, Anglo-Catholic, Low Church, or Evangelical, and others. The various churches of the Anglican Communion, though autonomous, are bound together by a common heritage and a common doctrinal and liturgical concerns, and there has always been a considerable amount of interchange of ecclesiastical personnel. And then authority and structure, I want to go over that a little bit. The Anglican Communion consists of autonomous national churches that are bound together by the intangible links that best described as ties of loyalty between the See of Canterbury and each other. And so churches are pretty loose, but at the same time, they have connections. Although the Archbishop of Canterbury is respected throughout the communion and his words carry great moral authority, he exercises no jurisdiction over any part of the communion other than the Diocese of Canterbury and the Church of England as a whole, through the authority vested in synods and convocations. And so the basic unit of the Anglican Communion is the diocese, which is a geographic area over which a bishop presides. I think that's sort of how Catholicism functions as well. dioceses, they generally form part of a larger unit known as a province, but even these are far from uniform in configuration. A province may, for example, be part of an autonomous church. The Anglican Church of Australia has 5 provinces, and that of Canada 4. The Church of England and Ireland have 2 each, and then the Episcopal Church in the United States of America, ECUSA, has 9. And so they kind of divide certain areas of the country up. Some provinces, however, include whole countries such as Japan, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. Other provinces cover a number of countries, such as the provinces of Southern Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, the West Indies, and the Southern Cone of America. And on occasion, one diocese covers a whole country or even several countries, such as the Diocese of Polynesia. And variations occur in the titles of the heads of the various provinces or national churches. England has 2 archbishops, which is Canterbury and York, as it historically has been, known as metropolitans, as does Ireland. Canada has a primate who has no province and 4 metropolitans. And then Australia has 5 archbishops, one of whom, while having jurisdiction over a province, is known as the primate. And then the Church of England and that of Brazil each have a primate who also has a diocese. And the United States has a presiding bishop and a primate, both without a diocese. So a little bit complicated, but you get the idea. And then internal developments, I'm going to go over that. The mother church of the Anglican Communion, the Church of England, has maintained close connections with the state. It has representative bishops in the House of Lords and can properly be called the established church, even though contrary to much popular opinion, it is in no sense supported financially by the state. And then the Church of England itself is without question the church of the English people, even though many of the country's citizens do not so regard it. The Anglican Communion has never had much worldwide structure. Indeed, it has been characterized by its lack of structure. And like I pointed to, that's generally true. The Lambeth Conference of 1968 recommended the formation of the Anglican Consultative Council, an advisory body of about 60 members, including bishops, clergy, and lay persons. Its president is the Archbishop of Canterbury. And the council shares information, coordinates policy, and develops unified mission strategies. And so that's, again, they're loose connections between Anglican churches, but they do still have meetings, and then they have this Anglican Consultative Council where they can talk to one another about what's going on. So it's sort of a loose connection. Although it lacks binding authority, the council increases the Anglican tendency toward consultation in matters of faith and life. The importance of conversation among Anglicans is reflected in the extent of change in some branches of the Anglican Communion. And so that's something that I was excited to talk about. It says in the second half of the 20th century, most churches of the Anglican world revised their versions of the Book of Common Prayer. That's the big book for the Anglicans. In the United States, revision of the Episcopalian prayer book was extensive. The new prayer book of 1979 reflected years of liturgical study, trial drafts, and discussion. It offered unprecedented liturgical options, including the use of modern English liturgies and opportunities for informal worship. The controversy generated by the book abated only slowly. Equally controversial were the admission of women to the church's priesthood and the prospect of women bishops. So that's something that I noticed. I've only been to one Anglican church as far as I know. My sister-in-law goes to an Anglican church, and they have female priests and female bishops, which is kind of cool. But it says, equally controversial was the admission of women to the church's priesthood and the prospect of women bishops. And that was a controversy, actually, within Anglicanism. But women had been ordained priests in Hong Kong in 1944 and in 1971. By the mid-1970s, women in various parts of the Anglican world called for the priesthood to be open to them. The impact was greatest in the United States and Canada, where women eventually contributed a significant percentage of seminary students. And so there was a pretty heavy debate about this. American Episcopalians, they approved women as priests in 1976 after heated debate. And so that was definitely a case of women gaining a significant power within the Anglican Church, which is great. And while several other Anglican churches took a similar course, the Church of England preferred to study the issue. Opponents of the ordination of women feared the loss of the church's Catholic heritage, while advocates saw a chance for Anglican leadership in expanding the ministries open to women in the church. And so after 2 decades of debate, the Church of England ordained its first women priests in 1994. So that was pretty interesting. Church of England took till 1994 to approve of women. So it's been 30 years, actually, yeah. The Lambeth Conference of 1988, it confronted the possibility that a woman could become a bishop in the United States. That possibility became a reality in 1989 when Barbara C. Harris was ordained bishop. And so in subsequent years, other women were consecrated as bishops. In 1990, New Zealander Penelope Jameson became the first diocesan bishop. And in 2006, the ECUSA elected Catherine Jefferts Shorey as the first woman presiding bishop of any member church of the Anglican Communion. So very, very female-friendly within the Anglican Church. The Church of England formally approved the consecration of women as bishops in 2014. The election of women as bishops or presiding bishops were welcomed by some members of the Anglican Communion and strongly opposed by others. So naturally, it became a divisive topic. The consecration in 2003 of V. Gene Robinson, an openly gay man, as the bishop of the U.S. state of New Hampshire, posed another challenge to Anglican solidarity. And so this was another issue too, was the ordination or consecration of a LGBTQ community member. Robinson's consecration was met with strong opposition throughout the church, especially in Africa, where bishops called for the ECUSA to repent and come closer to forging a schism. And it came close to forging a schism over the matter. And so there was nearly a breakaway over this issue. There has also been impressive growth in Africa and Asia, all sparked by indigenous leadership, and Anglicanism has thus become as much a non-Western as a Western form of Christianity. And then relations with other churches, I want to talk about that. Anglicans see themselves as catalysts for Christian unity, and the Anglican blend of Catholic liturgy and Protestant procedure appears to afford the basis of a broad ecumenical encounter. And that's definitely true too. Is like my Presbyterian father-in-law, he seems to like a lot of Anglicanism too, because it probably reminds him of Presbyterianism, which he belongs to. Anglicanism has points in common with virtually all other expressions of the Christian faith. Anglicans readily engage Roman Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant leaders in theological discussion and joint liturgy. And then World Anglicanism, the Anglican Communion, has tried to bridge the gulf between Protestant, Roman, and Eastern Orthodox churches. And so mostly, Anglicanism is pretty peaceful. It's always willing to forge alliances, something that's really important, especially in our world. Then I wanted to jump in the most exciting part of this, the Anglican Teaching on Animals by C.S. Lewis. So he had a lot to say about animals, and C.S. Lewis was a noted critic of animal experimentation. Just look up to here's a cool little thing I found. It said, C.S. Lewis was a critic of vivisection, the practice of performing surgical experiments on living animals. So that's sort of a blanket term for animal experimentation. Yeah, Lewis argued against vivisection from a Christian theological perspective, contending that animals, unlike humans, could not morally benefit from pain, thereby making suffering inflicting on them for human gain inherently unethical. He linked support for vivisection to a broader moral decline, suggesting it was a symptom of an amoral utilitarianism that could justify cruelty to any inferior being, including humans. And when they say inferior to, they just mean like, a helpless individual, so an individual that can't help themselves, not strong, in other words. But Clive Staples Lewis, C.S. Lewis, in other words, he was born November 29th, 1898, and he died November 22nd, 1963. There's actually a couple movies about him actually in his life. There's one called Shadowlands. That one's pretty good. They made two versions of that one. One is with Anthony Hopkins, and then another one that came out was it was called like a Talk with Freud or something. I have to look up what the name of it was. I just watched it recently though, but there was a theorized meeting between C.S. Lewis and Sigmund Freud and what they would have talked about. And so that was what the movie was. But Matthew Goode played C.S. Lewis, and ironically, Anthony Hopkins played Sigmund Freud. And it's ironic because Anthony Hopkins played C.S. Lewis in Shadowlands. So I thought that was interesting. Sigmund Freud, C.S. Lewis movie. It was called Freud's Last Session. That's it. Yeah, it was a pretty good movie. I liked it a lot. There's kind of like two people that had no business meeting each other. And the theory is that they met, but there's some loose evidence of it. But what they would have said during the course of that conversation was definitely something that someone wanted to make a movie out of, and it was smart too. but very fascinating dialogue. But C.S. Lewis, he was a British writer, literary scholar, and Anglican lay theologian. He's best known as the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, but he is also noted for his other works of fiction, such as the Screwtape Letters and the Space Trilogy, and for his non-fiction Christian apologetics, including Mere Christianity, Miracles, and the Problem of Pain. Those are all pretty well-known books. And he had a wife actually named Joy, and their romance is discussed in that movie Shadowlands. But according to Lewis's 1955 memoir, Surprised by Joy, a little bit of a pun there, Joy is capitalized, meaning his wife. He was baptized in the Church of Ireland, but fell away from his faith during adolescence. Lewis returned to Anglicanism at the age of 32, owing to the influence of Tolkien and other friends, and he became an ordinary layman of the Church of England. Lewis's faith profoundly affected his work, and his wartime radio broadcasts on the subject of Christianity brought him wide acclaim. And so C.S. Lewis, some of his quotes about animal experimentation are really fascinating. And he said, C.S. Lewis on animal experimentation: if we cut up beasts simply because they cannot prevent us and because we are backing our own side in the struggle for existence, it is only logical to cut up imbeciles, criminals, enemies, or capitalists for the same reasons. And he's basically saying there that, if we can just cut up animals because we can and nothing can prevent us, then what stops us from doing that to other humans that are maybe not as powerful or as more despised? So he makes a good point there. And imbecile too. That's sort of like a word that's been transformed into a derogatory term, but it's not meant to be. I think what he means is like someone who is defenseless. Imbecile. Yeah, it's like how a word used to be benign, and then it's now become an insult. Imbecile. Yeah, it means idiotic is what the meaning is now, but archaically it probably had a different meaning. To people of the second order in a former and discarded classification of intellectual disability, with a mental age of 3 to 7, and so people that were obviously had mental cognitive difficulties were called imbeciles, but that was not meant to be an offensive term. It has since become an offensive term, but it's kind of like how Ellen G. White, she said that they're dumb animals, and today that would be insulting, but she meant as like, they just can't speak. Dumb just meant you couldn't speak. So C.S. Lewis, he also said, it made me very natural to have this loyalty to our own species, but let us hear no more from the naturalists about the sentimentality of anti-vivisectionists. If loyalty to our own species, preference for man simply because we are men, is not sentiment, then what is? And that's C.S. Lewis saying basically that, people who have compassion for animals and experiments, they're being sentimental. But, what is loyalty to your own species but sentiment? So is sentiment wrong? Of course not. It's just that they're not willing to torture humans yet. And then C.S. Lewis said, man was appointed by God to have dominion over the beasts, and everything a man does to an animal is either a lawful exercise or a sacrilegious abuse of an authority by divine right. And that was within the context, I believe, of animal experimentation. And he was implying that animal experimentation is a sacrilegious abuse of an authority. And, it's definitely not a lawful exercise. And then he also said, man, even now, can do wonders to animals. My cat and dog live together in my house and seem to like it. It may have been one of man's functions to restore peace to the animal world. If he had not joined the enemy, he might have succeeded in doing so to an extent now hardly imaginable. And that was C.S. Lewis talking about, human responsibility over animals. And then he also said, my own eyes are not enough for me. I will see through the eyes of others. Reality, even seen through the eyes of many, is not enough. I will see what others have invented. Even the eyes of all humanity are not enough. I regret that the brutes cannot write books. Very gladly I would learn what face things present to a mouse or a bee. More gladly still, I would perceive the olfactory world charged with all the information and emotion it carries for a dog. And so C.S. Lewis there, sort of by proxy is basically stating that, animals have value too, and that the experiences that they could tell us if they could make words, and that they probably live a really interesting life. And he was in tune with that. And then he also said, in justifying cruelty to animals, we put ourselves also on the animal level. We choose the jungle and must abide by our choice. And that was C.S. Lewis. And that's a great quote too, because he's basically saying, if we want to pretend not to be civilized, and we instead cut up animals, we start to act like them as well. Some of the more vicious ones. And so then, if we become vicious, and then there's side effects, well, then we earned it. And he makes a really great point there that harming animals ends up harming humans too. And then this verse, it says, C.S. Lewis was an animal lover, and throughout his lifetime, he expressed affection for both dogs and cats. I have written about the dogs in Lewis's life in the past, and the fact is that his residence was also home to a number of cats as well. In 1962, he wrote to a correspondent who asserted they held much in common. He agreed on one score: we are also both ruled by cats. Joyce Siamese, my stepcat as I call her, is the most terribly conversational animal I ever knew. She talks all the time and wants doors and windows to be open for her 1,000 times an hour. And then he continues, to be fair, most dogs I know also regard their people as doorkeepers and chefs. And then the author, that's what the author said. I'm sorry. After C.S. Lewis, but I'll just read it again. C.S. Lewis said, it's in 1962, he wrote to a correspondent who asserted they held much in common. He agreed on one score, and C.S. Lewis said, we are also both ruled by cats. Joyce Siamese, my stepcat as I call her, is the most terribly conversational animal I ever knew. She talks all the time and wants doors and windows to be open for her 1,000 times an hour. And that sounds a lot like cats too. They think of it's like the famous meme. Dogs think of you as their parents, and cats think of you as their roommates, or maybe servants too. That might be more accurate. But this author says, to be fair, most dogs I know also regard their people as doorkeepers and chefs. But among Lewis's references to cats is this quaint observation shared with a different correspondent of the same year. But C.S. Lewis says, yes, it is strange that anyone should dislike cats. But cats themselves are the worst offenders in this respect. They very seldom seem to like one another. So that made me laugh. And then also, too, cats, it's like cats, they sometimes, a lot of times, they don't even like humans either. So you got to have a love for them. I'm not a huge cat fan. They're fine, but I believe they obviously, like all animals and all humans, have inherent dignity. They shouldn't be harmed for trivial reasons. And then the last portion of today's episode, I just want to talk about the Anglican Society for the Welfare of Animals, as well as another organization. And I found these two organizations. They're both Anglican, and they're very great animal welfare organizations. But they said, who are we? We are an Anglican Church of England organization founded over 30 years ago. We are called to make Christians and others aware of the need to care for the whole of creation. In particular, we are concerned with the abuse of animals, intensive farming, the food chain, experimentation, diseases associated with animals, the ill treatment of pets, and the killing of animals for pleasure all raise ethical questions. Animal issues are theological issues and should be on the church's agenda. We believe that God has given us a responsibility towards sentient beings with whom we share God's world. The Bible teaches us that God has given us dominion, not domination, over animals. Genesis 1:26-28. And then this means loving care, not ruthless exploitation. And I like how they put that too. I always say that dominion means care for, not tyranny. They say we teach respect for all creation and highlight the ways in which humans suffer as a result of human neglect. Which animals suffer as a result of human neglect, exploitation, and cruelty. We acknowledge our own part in not caring for the environment and the need for awareness and education to bring about change. And then they said, what do? We encourage churches to include animal welfare concerns in their prayers. Worship and thanksgiving are at the heart of Christian life and embrace all that God has made. We encourage and help churches to hold animal blessing services and to be aware of the need to care for God's creation. So there's their website if you'd like to check them out more. But I thought that was really great. And then I found this other one, this very sweet and sensitive organization. It's called Christ the Savior Anglican Church, Ministry to Pet Families. And they say, losing a beloved pet hurts, and too often we feel isolated with our sadness and questions. Christ the Savior Anglican Church believes no one should grieve alone and offers faith-based grief support for people after the deaths of their animal family members, helping them find comfort, peace, and the answers they're seeking. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then it goes on, ministry to pet families. Because Christ the Savior believes pets are gifts from God and are cherished members of our families, we offer blessing of the animals to honor the feast day of St. Francis of Assisi, special events at local dog perks, prayer, grief support, and words of comfort at services in memory of a pet. And then they have this nice little article I found. It says a theology of pets. Does the Bible say anything about pets? Actually, it says a lot about animals, and that includes our pets. Animals are gifts from God. The pets we love that bring so much joy to our lives are gifts from God. He loves to give good gifts and does not withhold good things from his children. His blessings come to everyone, whether we recognize them or not. It is right to give thanks to God for the good gifts of our pets. Animals help us know God. Countless stories illustrate the unconditional love and devotion of pets. Service animals aid and guide their human companions, and some animals protect or save human lives, even sacrificing their own in the process. When animals act in these ways, they can help us to understand the steadfast love of God, who is slow to anger, merciful, gracious, and faithful. How does your pet help you to know God? And then it goes on. It says God created animals before people. He formed all kinds of animals out of the ground and gave them the breath of life, even before he created humans in his image. When God looked at the animals he had made, he called them good. Animals lived together peacefully in Eden. Only after humans sinned were animals forced to suffer and live in a broken world. Animals belong to God. He is their ultimate owner. Our pets are on loan to us. Psalm says that God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, and that obviously means all the hills, not just 1,000 hills. God cares about animals. God watches over all of his animals, and even the swallow builds her nest by his altar. God saved animals from destruction in Noah's ark, and afterwards made a covenant promising animals would never suffer judgment in the same way again. That's Genesis 9. Animals look to God to feed and provide for them. God makes grass grow for livestock, and the young lions roar to him for prey. Sometimes humans are God's instruments of care. For example, oxen treading out the grain were not to be muzzled but allowed to eat. And we feed and shelter our pets. We are caring for them in ways that please God. God entrusts care for animals to humans. Actually, he entrusts care for the entire world to humans. And the first human named the animals. I always talk about that in Genesis 2:19-20, where Adam names the animals. And a lot of people were like, oh, well, he was naming them by scientific classification. Like, no, he was naming them because they were his friends. Yeah, it's like how we name our dogs. That's exactly what God did. He named Abraham, and then he considered Abraham a friend. And it says we have authority and responsibility to ensure animals are properly cared for. God does not condone animal abuse, and Balaam's donkey saved her owner's life by turning aside from the angel she saw in the road. Balaam could not see the angel and beat his donkey for her disobedience. God opened her mouth, and the donkey asked Balaam why he beat her when she was always faithful. The angel defended the donkey to her owner. Not only should we always be kind to our pets, but it may be that animals can perceive the spiritual realm in ways we do not. And that's pretty interesting there. God cares about the death of animals. Jesus said that not even a sparrow falls to the ground without God's notice. And so while animals could be killed for food or sacrifice, killing someone's animal required paying back the owner life for life. And so God commanded animal sacrifice, but only temporarily until Jesus came. Animals were important to the sacrificial system because they are innocent of the sin that breaks the world, but are damaged by it anyway. And so sacrificial animals could not have any flaws, which pointed toward the sinless sacrifice of God's Son. Jesus is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And since Jesus died for the sins of the world, animals do not need to be sacrificed any longer. So that was a really great part of Jesus' ministry. Animals need redemption too. Animals did not sin, humans did, but animals suffer the effects from our sin. So as a result, animals do not need forgiveness, but they need redemption, as with everything in creation. And they cite Romans 8:19-23, basically saying that animals will be resurrected. And so when animals die, God takes their spirit and their flesh returns to dust. But like everything that dies, animals die because humans sinned and thus entered God's perfect world. We were created to live forever, so death feels wrong. So it is natural to mourn the loss of a beloved pet. And that's very true, too. The Bible's very honest about that, about death being an enemy. So that's why we feel so sad about it. And that includes animals as well, in Romans 8 as well as Ecclesiastes 3. Jesus shares our sorrows and we can comfort one another. Jesus makes all things new, including animals. And so Jesus came to fix our broken world. Through his cross and resurrection, he defeated sin and death. And someday he will return and make creation perfect again. He will enact a special covenant for the animals that promises that they will live in safety forever. That's Hosea 2:18. Who knows? Maybe they'll even be able to talk like Balaam's donkey. And animals will be in heaven. The new heaven and new earth will be a place where predators and predator lay down together and live with God's forgiven people in peace and harmony for all eternity, with no death, hunger, or pain. And they're citing, I think, Isaiah 11, Revelation 21 there. And it says, next time you see a dog and a cat snuggling with a human baby, that is a sneak peek into what heaven will be like. And then they cite, Isaiah 11, 65, 25, and Revelation 21, 1 to 4. And then one of my favorite quotes, it says, paradise is open to all of God's creatures. Martin Luther, in talking about his own dog at the point of death, said, be thou comforted, little dog. Thou too in resurrection shall have a little golden tail. And that was cute. I talked about that with Lutheranism, about how when Martin Luther, he saw a dog on the street that had his tail cut off, and it was because he got his tail caught in a wagon. And so Martin Luther came over and pet him and said, don't worry, at the resurrection, you'll have a little golden tail to make up for the tail that you lost. And I thought that was really, really sweet and really cute about Martin Luther. But so that was the end of Anglicanism. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I certainly learned a lot from this one too. I'm glad I did this one. And then the next, I'm trying to think when the next, it'll be, today's August 31st, so it'll be like September 14th, I think, is the next teaching. I have to look and see what the schedule is. It might be Methodism or maybe Baptists. I have to look. But anyways, I'll close out in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for allowing me to preach your word and the history of your church, and help us to be guided by your word, where it says the wolf will lay with the lamb and no one will hurt or destroy it on my holy mountain. Amen. And thank you guys so much for tuning in, and I'll see you guys in 2 weeks. Looking forward to the conversation. And then have a great Sunday and a great Labor Day, and I will see you guys in 2 weeks.